Hello, welcome to the fourth video in this series. In this video we're going to create the big picture layout with CSS Grid. So we're going to get this two-column layout for the tablet, and we'll get the three-column layout for desktop. And we're going to try to do that in the least code that we can. So before we go to the CSS, just a correction I want to make here. In a previous video we had talked about including the header element as part of the main container, and I realized that I hadn't actually done that. I had the main element down here in a previous video. That would work. You could do it like that, and in fact some of the CSS that we're going to write would be simpler if we did it this way. But what we had talked about was including the header inside the main, because maybe that makes more sense semantically if you're considering that header to be part of the main content of the page. It's up for debate, I guess. That's arguable. I guess it kind of depends on, the broader context of the rest of the website. But that's what we had talked about, so I fixed that so that main element is now opening right above the header and closing right here below the bottom logo and above the footer. Another thing I did in between videos was add some background colors to each of those sections just to make them easier to see, easier to identify where they start and end. And I did that in the internal style sheet on the HTML file, so that way we can just really easily delete those when we're through with them, and we don't have to search through the style sheet. Okay, and one more thing before we move on to the CSS. We are going to need to target this, where is it? Where are you? Here, no, I already deleted it. Sorry. There was an image here that was like just a placeholder image for the video. So we're gonna delete that and just go ahead and add the actual video. So I just found that on YouTube. You can just search for generic brand video and find that. So I will share and grab the embed code and come on. There. Copy that and paste that right in there. We're doing that right now because we're going to need to target this with CSS because of the way our page is laid out. This video spans two columns while the images don't. So we need to select this specific element with our CSS, and so might as well just put the actual iframe in there. Okay, so let's move on to the CSS. First thing we need to do is create a media query to create our breakpoint for tablet. So at media screen and min width, and I'll just choose an arbitrary breakpoint here, 700 pixels. We'll see how that looks. We need to create a grid container, and that's going to be our main element. So we'll say main display grid. And we know that for tablet, we need to have a two-column layout. Even though we have elements that are spanning multiple columns, we're still going to have a two-column layout. We're going to have two columns going up the entire grid container. So we do that with good old grid template columns, and then we'll create our two columns with our favorite unit, FR. So 1FR, 1FR, we'll create those two equal width columns. There's two FRs total, 1 plus 1 is 2, so each one will take up 1/2 of that space. So we have two equal width columns there. All right. We're gonna need to make some of these items span two columns. The header and this video both span two columns. Everything else takes up one of the two columns, but those two things span. The other thing we need to do is change the order. So let's go ahead and do the order. Let's do the order first. And the order property just takes a number as a value. So order 1, order 2. And the highest number order will come last, and the lowest number will come first. The default value for order is 0. So right now, all of these items, the header, the section, the div class media, this section, and this image, all have an order of 0. And when the value for order is tied, then what determines the order is the order that they are in the HTML. So right now they're just following the source order in the HTML. We want to give them a different order so that basically this selling points section comes after the media. So we can give that anything more than 0, and that will make it come after those. So let's do it. Let's go ahead and do that. Class selling points order 1. Okay, and I'll go ahead and see what that looks like in the browser. It's not going to look right yet because we need to do some other stuff, but just to show you, we now have that selling points down here at the bottom. It's still above the footer because we're just changing the order of stuff within that main element, within the grid container. So the footer is still all the way on the bottom, and then the selling points is the last thing within that main element. We don't want it to be the very last thing, though. We want it to be... this is an interesting question. What should come after selling points? This logo or this categories text? To answer that, you need to think about how the grid will fill in the columns, and it just does it from left to right. So it'll fill in the leftmost cell, and then whatever is next in the order, it will take up that next column. So in that case, we want the categories section to be next, right after the selling points, and then we want our logo to be last. So to make categories come after selling points, we'll just give it an order that's more than 1, so 2. And then to make the bottom logo come last, we'll give it an order that's more than that. So 1, 2, 3, and then the header and the media div still have an order of 0. We haven't changed that, so so those will still come first, and the media will come after header because it's after the header in the HTML. So again, we're just trying to do that in the least code possible. We could explicitly give everything in order. We could say header order 1, media order 2, selling points order 3, categories order 4, bottom logo order 5. If that helps you, if that makes more sense to you, then feel free to do it that way as well. But let's just check and make sure that this looks correct. So we have our header is taking up a column here on the left. We have our media taking up a column on the right. And then we have our selling points, our categories, and our logo all in the correct order. So that's good. The next thing we need to change here is making the header take up 2 columns, because right now it's just taking up 1 column on the left. And so to do that, we will select header, and we will tell it to span 2 columns. So the property for that is grid column. Grid column is what you use to tell an element that you want it to start on one grid line and end on another grid line, or to start here and span 2 columns or span 3 columns. So we could do something like where we tell it to start at grid line 1 and end in grid line 3. That would work. That would make it take up exactly those 2 columns. We could also say, instead, we could say start at grid line 1 and span 2. So that does the exact same thing. In an effort to use the least amount of code, though, the default is that it starts at 1. It's going to start at 1 just naturally because it's the first grid item. And so we actually don't even need that. We can just say, hey, start wherever you're going to start, and then just span 2 columns. And so we get this. So now that header is taking up that entire space, and the media is now taking up a column here. So now we have a kind of interesting problem. Moving on to the media section. The media section kind of spans 2 columns because of the video inside it, but then the individual images inside there each take up 1 column. So there's a few different ways that we could make this work. One solution to this problem doesn't exist yet, and that's subgrid. Incidentally, I'm recording this video in mid-November 2018. So if you're coming across this later, maybe subgrid is a thing now, so you might want to look that up and learn a little bit about subgrid. But for right now, we don't have subgrid, so we need to come up with another solution. One solution would be we could make this media div span 2 columns, and then we could make it itself a grid to align all of the items within it. I am going to show you a different solution, though, one that's kind of nifty, and that is the relatively new value of display contents. And what display contents does is it makes this media div container kind of like it's not there. So it's as if the code looked like that for the purposes of layout. Obviously that div is still there in the code. It would still be there for semantic purposes and everything else, but just for the purposes of layout, it's as if that media div doesn't exist. And so what happens is that this iframe and these 2 images then become grid items, and we can tell them to take up a certain amount of cells and columns for our main element grid. So don't actually delete that media div. I'm just showing you kind of what it is like. But display contents on the media will, as you can see here, now each of those children of the media div are acting as an individual grid item. And so we want this video to span 2. So we're going to select that media iframe. Same thing we did with the header, grid column, span 2. Okay, there we go. Starting to kind of look like something here. Alright, that's getting pretty close to our tablet layout. The last thing we need is to fix this part. If we look at our mockup, this categories text takes up the whole space that this text in the logo takes up. So if we look at our grid cells here, open up the inspector, highlight these cells. So there's our selling points, our categories, and then the grid has created another row to fit the logo. So what we want to happen instead is that basically we want this this categories text to take up 2 rows, so that it will take up the same amount of space as these 2 items here. So this is the same idea as spanning grid columns, but in this case we're spanning grid rows. So just select categories and grid row span 2. Refresh, and there we go. So it's easier to see with that background color what exactly is going on there. So yeah, that's pretty much our tablet. Obviously we still need to do the header, but we'll get to that later. We're just focused on like the big picture layout right now. And we have our tablet layout. So let's move on to desktop. For desktop, we just need to switch to the 3-column thing, and probably don't need to do too much here. So let's create our next breakpoint for desktop. Oops, screen and then width. Again, just kind of picking an arbitrary number here. So remember that everything is retained. Everything we did here in this media query applies here as well. So if there's anything here that we don't want to apply, then we need to override it with a new declaration. And anything that we want to keep, we don't have to change it. It will stay in that order for this media query as well. So the things that we need to change are, we need to go from 2 columns to 3 columns. So let's select our main element, and we'll say grid template columns 1FR, 1FR, 1FR to create our 3 equal width columns. And we need our header this time to span 3 instead of span 2. Grid column span 3. Okay. And let's go ahead and see what that looks like. We're not quite done yet, but let's just see. There's our header spanning 3, and things get a little wonky down here. So the first thing let's do is undo what we did with our media div, because in this case that media div is all taking up one column. All the video and the images all in it are taking up a single column. So let's just undo what we did up here. So we'll just change it back to the default value, which would be display block. So now this media div becomes the grid item instead of each of its children being grid items. And what else do we need to do? How do we get this logo? Maybe we need to have the media span too as well, right? So that, yeah. So this column will take up like 1 row, 2 rows. Oh, you can't see where my hands are pointing at. Sorry. This will take up 1 row. The text, the logo will take up 1 row, and then both of these, the outer columns, will take up 2 rows. So let's try that. Grid row span 2. So we're doing for the media column the same thing we did for the categories up here. Hopefully that works. My God, it did. Alright. So there we have it. That's our layout. We're done. Well, we're not quite done. We still need to spruce it up and make it actually look good. We need to change the background colors. We need to change the font colors, change the spacing, and the big thing is the header. At this point, though, as far as like the workflow, you know, we did our planning, we did our HTML, we got our CSS set up, and we did the big picture layout. Once you have all that done, it's pretty much up to you where you want to go next, because we've kind of separated out everything into chunks. At this point, we're just diving into each section and making each of those sections actually look more like the mock-up. So from here on out, we're going to be we're done with the layout. We're going to be doing specifically just making the nav look good. We'll do the header. We'll do the selling point section. Each one of those sections individually. And it doesn't really matter what order you do those in. So if you're a person who likes to like take on the hardest challenge first, you could do that. Maybe start with getting that header all rearranging in those different layouts. Or if you're somebody who likes to just go for the low-hanging fruit stuff, the stuff that's easiest to kind of get stuff done and be feeling good about things, then you just start with sprucing up the selling points text. So in the future videos, I'm going to be doing each of those sections, but you could watch them in whatever order you want from here on out. So if you're following along, you know, feel free to just kind of pick and choose and choose your own adventure here. All right, so the next video in sequence, I don't know what I want to do next. I guess, let's do a nav bar, just because that's something a little different. We'll use Flexbox to make our nav bar Looking good. Alright, so see you in the next video.